In this video, I want to cover emotion from a definitional standpoint, as well as covering some of the major theories in psychology about exactly what emotion is in terms of the relationship of the various factors involved. So at the very top of this slide here, we have the textbook definition of emotion, a subjective state of being that we often describe as our feelings. So, maybe you're feeling sad, maybe you're feeling embarrassed, maybe you're feeling proud. Emotion, it's part of our lives. It's always with us, maybe sometimes stronger than others, but importantly, emotion is what motivates our thoughts and behaviors. Some of the examples that you might have been reading about, if you experience the emotion of fear, because you just saw a snake, that might motivate you to run, in order to avoid being bitten by a snake, I suppose. So emotion and motivation go hand in hand. Importantly, though, emotion is pretty complex. And in fact, humans can experience really complex examples of emotions that other animals might not be able to. The first thing that comes to my head is things like bittersweet. Something can feel happy and sad at the same time. But at its most basic level, emotion is a mix of three factors. The first is physiological arousal, and that refers to increased fight or flight reaction. So the sympathetic nervous system, increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure, that reaction is involved in emotion. The second is expressive behavior. So we actually change the way we act depending on the emotion we are experiencing. And then finally, cognitive processing. We have different thoughts in our head depending on what emotion we are experiencing. So compare two very basic emotions, happy and sad. Let's say you hear really good news. The physiological arousal is, increased heartbeat. You're going to be experiencing some more energy because you got good news. Expressive behavior is going to change. You might stand up really tall. You might clap. You might pump your fist in the air. And the third is cognitive processing. So good news might bring about thoughts of, thinking like, yes, this is great. I'm so happy. These are the things that are flowing through your mind. Now, on the other hand, let's say you get bad news and you feel sad. That's also going to have these three components. Physiological arousal. Bad news will often increase heartbeat. It does increase that fight or flight reaction. Expressive behavior is different, though. When you're sad, you might slump down a little bit. You might kind of look down. Cognitive processing is different as well. When you're sad, the thoughts going through your head might be, oh no, what am I going to do? Things like that. All right, so emotion is more than just one thing, of course. It's many things. There's a bodily reaction. There is a cognitive reaction. And so for that reason, psychologists have, for quite some time now, tried to assess the relationship between what's going on in the body and what's going on in the mind in terms of emotion. There have been a number of theories proposed, but I would probably argue that these three are the most well-known in psychology. And let's start with the first one, the James-Lange Theory. This actually dates back to the late 1800s. So over, 125 years ago or so, people were already trying to figure out this idea of emotion from a scientific perspective. So James and Lange, two theorists who argued that arousal, the sympathetic nervous system fight or flight, that comes before emotion. So they basically argued that, as one example, your heart starts pounding and then you interpret that as fear. So the good thing about this theory is that they were separating the different components of emotion. They were saying that there's something going on with the body, there's something going on with the mind, but there's a major criticism to this theory. The criticism is that whether I'm experiencing fear or happiness or whatever emotion, we still have the same physiological arousal, increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure, etc. So how do I know, whether or not my racing heart is a sign of sadness or happiness? Because there's something going on. I'm definitely separating those two emotions, but the James-Lange theory doesn't account for any of that sort of cognitive appraisal, if you will. So then we go to the Cannon and Bard theory, another theory with two researchers who propose that emotion occurs at the same time as the physiological arousal. Essentially, they argue that my increased heartbeat and my mind are activated at the exact same time. It's just completely simultaneous, yet separate. And in fact, there's an interesting criticism to that theory as well, and I believe this is more of a modern criticism. But if you take a quadriplegic individual, which is somebody who cannot feel below the neck, and take an individual who is quadriplegic because of an accident. So at one point they could use their body completely normally, completely functionally, and then they got into an accident, like a car accident, and then lose the ability to feel anything from the neck down. What research has shown is that these individuals still experience emotion, but oftentimes they report that their emotion isn't as visceral. For example, anger doesn't feel as strong to these individuals. Now, why is that important? It's important because what it tells us is that the arousal and the cognitive processing are not happening at the same time. One must be happening before the other. In other words, the body, information from the body is then sent up to the brain to figure out what's going on. And if a person is quadriplegic or paralyzed from the neck down, that means that less information is being sent up to the brain about how the individual is feeling in terms of emotions. So Cannon and Bard, they're certainly correct in that there's a separation of different aspects of emotion, but they don't occur simultaneously, at least according to the third theory. The Schachter and Singer two-factor theory. Personally, I feel like this is the one that makes the most sense. Feel free to disagree. But these individuals proposed that emotion occurs as physiology and cognitions converge. All right, so what does that mean? Basically, they argue this. We, in an everyday scenario, we have an uncontrollable physiological reaction to the world around us. But it's my brain that looks around or collects information and decides what to do with it. So for example, imagine you're looking around and you see a snake. Uncontrollably, because of survival instinct, we are going to have increased fight or flight response, increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure. That's like a knee-jerk reaction, uncontrollable. But it's my cognition that is, my thoughts, things like, oh my gosh, that's a snake that could potentially harm me, that allows me to interpret that physiological arousal as fear. So I guess put in other words, I have an uncontrollable physiological reaction, and then I have to decide what to do with that information or what to do with that arousal. And if I see something that I perceive as scary, I'm going to label that arousal as a negative emotion. But if I perceive something as positive, I'm going to label that as a positive emotion. So let's use like one final example. Imagine you're walking at night and somebody comes up behind you and jumps at you. And immediately you're going to have increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure. That's completely normal. But then you turn around and it's your best friend and they have a smile on their face because they were just playing a prank on you. In other words, you might immediately start to interpret that situation as a joke and you might be happy. You would have that increased arousal and you would actually attribute it to, it was a fun and games, just a joke. On the other hand, if you turned around and saw somebody with a weapon, that arousal would then be interpreted as fear because the context, the environment allows you to interpret that arousal negatively. Well, The major point to consider is that emotions are complex, and they are a mix of these three factors: physiological arousal, expressive behavior, and cognitive processing. And more generally speaking, emotions are what drive our motivations.